The story of Broome would make a wonderful feature film. If it's war movies you're into, it's got surprise attacks by invading enemies. If it's disaster movies you're into, it has the brute force of nature being unleashed on a regular basis. And if it's swashbuckling stories of hunting for sea treasure, well, it has those too. This is Sun Pictures, Australia's oldest operating cinema and the world's oldest picture gardens. People from Broome have been coming here to watch picture shows since 1916. But the drama of Broome's survival, way up here on the northwest coast of Western Australia, is a story not even Hollywood could dream of. This jewel of the ocean is really Broome's reason for being. South Sea pearls are recognised as the best in the world, and pearling has always been the town's major industry. In 1882, a fella by the name of Alex McRae sailed into what we now know as Roebuck Bay and discovered rich beds of pearl shell. In those days, it was the mother of pearl shell that was the treasure, and the riches lying along the coast quickly drew the early settlers. Surveyor General John Forrest announced a town site on the northwestern point of Roebuck Bay. Ironically, Governor Broome, feeling the township was just a few graves and some itinerant fishermen, was very upset about the town taking his name. He wrote a letter to the Colonial Office in London demanding the name be changed. The request was refused. So Broome continued, and by 1889 the telegraph had arrived, and it had been gazetted a port. The price of mother of pearl shell had reached new heights, and there were fortunes to be made. Broome quickly became the Queen City of the North. The port was a spring or high tide port only, which means ships could only enter or leave on the spring high tide, and the lack of access at low tide was a constant source of frustration for Broome. In the early days, diving was an extremely dangerous occupation. The death toll was incredibly high. 1 out of every 4 divers would not survive. There was no modern underwater equipment, just a good set of lungs and in you went. Some boats even kidnap local Aboriginal people to work as slave divers. Things changed dramatically in the 1890s with the introduction of the canvas suit, the copper helmet, boots and air hose. It became a lot more complicated for the divers. These pearling luggers also led a precarious existence. No radar, no weather forecasts, and no real safe havens when the weather turned, as it did with cyclones in 1908, 1910, and particularly the one in 1912 caused extensive damage. But it was the declaration of war in 1914 that was to really devastate this frontier town. With the onset of war, the mother of pearl market collapsed. Luggers were left to ruin. Huge shell stockpiles were stored around town. More than half the population went to enlist, and the old Broome virtually disappeared within months. With the First World War coming to an end, Broome again rode the back of the price of pearl shell to prosperity. The Japanese had always had a presence here, even in the early days, but now they dominated the industry. There were more Japanese in Broome than white Europeans. They lived in a district ironically called Chinatown. Most were indentured workers. They had their own clubhouses, festivals and shops. During the 1930s, the divers were pushed to go much deeper than before, and it was estimated that nearly a diver a week was dying from the misunderstood condition known as the bends, caused by pressure changes while diving. Over 900 Japanese are buried in this special cemetery here, making it the largest Japanese cemetery in Australia. Most of them were men who died in the pursuit of mother of pearl. When Australia followed America and declared war on the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, Broome again came to a standstill.
The Japanese residents, always such an important part of the town, were rounded up and interned in camps. And as a result, the pearling industry virtually ceased.
As the Japanese forces advanced south towards Australia, Broome became a military evacuation point. In a decision designed to thwart an invasion force, the government purchased the majority of the pearl luggers and destroyed those that were unseaworthy. The evacuation of women and children also began.
2 engineers were on lookout up here, and on the 2nd of March 1942, they noticed a single Japanese reconnaissance plane flying overhead. The harbour at that stage was full of flying boats that were used in the evacuation of Indonesia and the Philippines.
Warnings went out to all the pilots that they should take off, but the tide and refuelling problems meant that none of them complied. The following morning, 9 Japanese fighters attacked.
The 2 targets were the aerodrome and the harbour, as some of the seaplanes were already full with passengers waiting at the end of the jetty here, and some of the boats were fully loaded with ammunition. So in no time, the harbour was ablaze with burning fuel and sinking vessels. And for those people on board, the bullets, the fire and the sharks made for a hellish mix.
One of the few images from the attack, captured by a Japanese pilot, shows the fleet of planes ablaze in the harbour and a huge plume of black smoke over the town.
At the attack here at the aerodrome, the Japanese Zeros were focusing on the array of Allied military aircraft lined up along the tarmac here. And in amongst the exploding aircraft and black smoke, a young gunner by the name of Gus Winkle tore off to the workshop to grab his machine gun, lining it up on his forearm. He then fired off round after round at the Japanese Zeros, finally scoring a direct hit and blowing one of the Zeros from the sky. Gus became the hero of the hour.
It's estimated that over 70 people were killed that morning. The remaining resident population were immediately evacuated. All remaining luggers and equipment were destroyed as part of a scorched earth policy. There was no one officially in charge of the town, and Broome was left for the looters. For the second time, war had brought the town to its knees.
Broome's recovery was a lot slower this time. The market for mother of pearl shell had virtually disappeared, and the economic devastation caused by the internment of the Japanese, the destruction of the pearl luggers, and the town's infrastructure meant it was a long way back to its former glory. Ironically, it was the Japanese pearling technique of culturing that was to be Broome's salvation this time.
The process of planting a foreign body into the shell is a delicate one, but one that revolutionised the industry. In its natural environment, it's estimated that about 1 in 5,000 oysters develop a pearl. So the technique of seeding the oyster, cleaning them every 3 to 6 months, and waiting for 2 years seems incredibly intensive, but it provides a far better result for the pearlers.
This is Pictada maxima, the largest pearl oyster in the world. What makes it so special is the thick, lustrous shell, so highly prized by the early pearlers. The treasure today is the size and quality of the pearls they can grow inside it.
Arrived in Broome in 1974. It was a quiet backwater. The pearling industry was practically moribund. There was only the one big pearling company. And then there was a tremendous flowering of the pearling industry. Now there are 16 farms, I think, based here. And the competition has sparked a lot of improvements. The methods 30 years ago were quite antiquated. Now they're extremely modern. We are now, I think, the most efficient producer of pearls in the world.
If they were handing out awards for survival to our iconic towns, well, I reckon Broome deserves an Oscar.
Broome claims to be Australia's first multicultural community, and it remains a true melting pot today in its current title role as a major tourist mecca.